Hi guys, welcome back. Bit of a different video today. I'm going to talk about the experiences I've had with the strange, the unexplained, the paranormal, however you want to talk about it. I'm going to talk a little bit about ghosts. I'm going to talk a little bit about big cats and unusual UFO incidents. And I'm not really the guy that's into that kind of thing. You know, I've got quite a scientific background. That's what I do for work, is science-based stuff. So I'm not someone who's naturally drawn to that. I was when I was a kid. You know, I remember we all used to chase around on our BMXs during the 80s looking for like haunted houses and UFO sightings. We spent a lot of time bombing around in Clapham Wood looking for strange occurrences and stuff like that. And I have to say, we never found anything. We were very disappointed, of course. We wanted to see scary things. But as I grew up, you know, I did have some unexplained experiences. The first of which happened when I was working down in an old RAF Observers Corps bunker in Lincolnshire. Now, I started working in this place probably about 12 or 13 years ago now. And I had heard lots of stories down in this bunker. You know, people had said they had had some unusual feelings. They felt like they weren't alone down there. A couple of staff even refused to go in there because they had seen something, you know, unexplained, a figure or whatever. I kind of laughed this off, and I've always put it down to maybe people wanted a bit of attention, maybe it was like a psychological thing. And I would work down there quite regularly on my own, and it was a creepy place. So this place was an ammunition manufacturer. They had taken over an old RAF Observers Corps bunker. That was where a lot of the ballistics work went on down below, and it was about sort of 2 stories down. It was a relic from war years that had been largely unused until this company had taken it over. Most of it you could access. There were 2 entry points, one on either side, and then you could go down into the base of it. To get in and out, you had to sign in on a wall chart because of health and safety aspects and the kind of testing that was going on down there. So it was not a place where anyone could go. There was a handful of people at work that could go in and out, and they were people that were classed as highly responsible, etc. So I was down there doing some work on my own, and I could hear another member of staff down in the bottom floor. Obviously you could hear a lot down there because it was like a concrete bunker. There wasn't much soft goods around, so all the sound travelled, and I could clearly hear footsteps and moving what we would call M2A1 cans around. So these are green tins that you basically put ammunition in and then you store it, and they're kind of airtight. They make a very, very recognisable sound when you move them about. And I could hear these things being opened and shut. I could hear footsteps. And I thought, oh, that might be one of the guys that I want to talk to. So I went down to the basement floor to have a look around, and there was no one there. I had a very unpleasant feeling when I was down there that I was kind of being watched. And I had a look around to see if someone was joking about. Joking about didn't usually happen in this place because, as I said, it was quite a serious kind of work. You know, when you're dealing with dangerous items and things that can explode, you don't really want to be messing about. So that would have been unusual. I went back up, checked the wall charts, no one had been in or out. I had a listen again, couldn't hear anything else. Went back to the office and I said, guys, you know, of all the people that could have been in and out of this place, and it was a locked door on either side, so you had to have a code that was strictly kept between ourselves. No one else had access to this code. So I asked the guys, who's just been down in the bunker? No one had been down there. And I said, well, someone has, because I could hear footsteps. Now, one of the old engineers, an ex-Rolls-Royce engineer, very serious guy, lovely dude as well, and he pulled me to the side and he said, listen, I've had a really strange experience down in the bunker that I haven't really shared with people because I didn't want to be laughed at, but it sounds similar to what you had. So I said, okay, you know, what's the deal? And basically he had heard an M2A1 can hit the ground and then come skidding out in the corridor in front of him. So he assumed obviously one of the people was operating in one of the rooms down there just off of the corridor. He had a look in the room, no one was in there at all. Now this M2A1 can had literally skidded along the floor. It had ammunition in it. It was quite heavy, And being an engineer, he then tried to replicate how that could have maybe fallen off a bench if it was left propped up on the top of a bench. Could it have fallen off and somehow skidded across the floor? And he tried all kinds of experiments to try and get this can to move sideways along the floor. It would have moved like a couple of meters, so this wasn't like a couple of inches that it moved. And whatever he did, you know, when it dropped off the bench, the only thing he could get it to do was kind of bounce around on the floor in front of the bench a couple of times. He could not get it at all to move horizontally, certainly not to the degree that he saw it. He swears that some force that is unexplained moved that can across the floor. My experience was there was someone down there that clearly hadn't been booked in or out, and I was unable to explain that as well. So that kind of cast some aspersions to my normal kind of theory that everything can be explained by science, you know, that it was psychology. I was in a good state of mind at the time. There was nothing unusual going on in my life. I certainly didn't imagine it, and I have no doubt that this other fellow, you know, was in the same state of mind. He wasn't a crazy drunkard, a drug addict, anything like that. He was a legitimate and good quality engineer, and he had had no history of having ghostly experiences. He didn't like that kind of thing. He didn't watch those kind of programs. So an interesting one. And that led me to a conversation then with a senior at that place who was an ex-RAF guy himself. And he said, it's interesting, you know, you're talking about these unexplained occurrences. He said, you know, I've had a couple of weird situations in my life. And again, this guy is a very professional man, not at all into kind of crazy wacky stuff. He had a, you know, a highly commendable career in the RAF at quite a senior level, and he said he had been involved when he was much younger on an RAF base in the UK, and he was tasked with basically securing the outskirts of the base. In terms of RAF bases, this is a fairly standard and menial task because, let's face it, not much happens at RAF bases, but they still have to secure them. So he would have been in charge of like a couple of guys that walk around the perimeter every so often, just checking mainly that kids aren't trespassing on the land, etc. One night they were keeping an eye out, you know, which probably meant sitting around in a canteen, and they were aware of some noise and some lights outside. Him and a couple of other guys went out and had a look, and this light was incredibly bright. It was coming from above them, and it was kind of painful on their skin. They couldn't ascertain what it was, and they all went back and reported this thing. It was huge. They thought it was some kind of aircraft, but the light was so bright they were unable to actually make any kind of visual sighting other than this huge bright light. So they then went and saw their superiors. Now, by the next morning, they had actually had burns on their skin. They had what looked like severe sunburn, and that can have only been attributed to this light that they saw. They hadn't been out in the sun. It was not a particularly bright time of year, and they'd all suddenly got it overnight. And they reported this to their senior officers. A couple of days later, they were actually asked to sign a document that they wouldn't talk to the press about this incident. They wouldn't mention it to anyone. Of course, he told me many years later. But that wasn't the only thing he experienced on the same base not so long after that. And interestingly, this was one of the bases where nuclear weapons were kept. And during that time scale, there was quite a lot of unusual activity around bases where that was happening. Conspiracy theorists would say that was like UFOs that were trying to prevent nuclear weapons being spread around the planet, or monitoring the nuclear weapons. Other people would say probably it was a foreign military doing something, using some advanced weaponry. But let's be honest, this was like 40 years ago. I would struggle to believe that we had advancements in weaponry then that were capable of emitting like massive radiation burns to an entire military camp. And I should mention that the three guys that my boss spoke about weren't the only ones affected. Quite a lot of other people on that camp had similar sunburn type symptoms, feeling unusual. On another separate occasion, they were patrolling and they had had a call that there'd been some people spotted lurking in the trees. they did see some figures walking through the trees, and my boss described this really, really thick overgrown area that was basically full of briar, which is like, you know, thorns and brambles. You wouldn't want to be walking through that. And he saw a figure walking directly through this stuff, and the figure seemed to have a sort of light around it. He couldn't distinguish any features. He just said it was a sort of blackish figure to look at, you know, like a shadowy figure with a kind of light illuminating from it, like a phosphorescence. And it was walking through undergrowth that would have been impossible for people to walk through. They tried to track these figures, obviously thinking, well, is this some sort of intruder? You know, what's going on? And it was not possible for them to track the figures properly, just because of the terrain that these things were moving through was literally impossible for humans to navigate. It was so thick with brambles and dense undergrowth. These figures moved through this terrain at a speed that would have been impossible. They were, you know, traveling at like a fast running speed, although they didn't appear to be running. Moved through this terrain and then completely disappeared. None of them were seen again by anyone else, and that was completely unexplained, how these figures could have moved through that type of terrain so quickly. They were not spotted by any kind of devices or security equipment at the time. Again, that would have been very, very basic stuff as well. They were only seen by a handful of people that were tracking these things and trying to you know, stop them and ask them what they were doing, thinking it was human intruders. Again, my boss didn't immediately jump to the UFO scenario. He said, I just don't know what that was. We obviously all thought it was very strange. Again, they were asked to sign some documentation that they weren't going to share that with media sources, and basically told, you know, don't worry about it, it's no big deal, it's all okay. A couple of years later, questions were asked about these incidents, and it was played off as some kind of special forces black ops training scenario, but no one could understand how that could have happened. Like, again, that time scale, SF didn't have things that could hover above air bases and emit huge doses of radiation to people and give everyone a massive sunburn, nor did they have the ability to kind of hover above undergrowth and move along unimpeded. And I still don't believe, I work in that sector now, I don't know of any technology that would allow people to just move at free will at that speed through extremely dense brambles and undergrowth. It just doesn't exist. Now we move into some more kind of scientifically explainable stuff. So when I was a kid, we used to go camping a lot, and we used to go camping in a specific place quite near to the village of Arundel in Sussex. Beautiful place. We used to go into some woods that was between Amberley and Arundel on the Duke of Norfolk's land, and he has a huge amount of land there. A lot of it is unused and unexplored, but part of it, I think it was called Southwood, had a kind of makeshift campsite, like wild camping. People used to go there, have you know, pitch a couple of tents, have a bit of a boozy party. So when we were about 12 or 13, we used to go there, of course, smoke some cheeky cigarettes, drink a bit of cider, generally have a bonfire and a jolly good time. And we often felt that we were being watched in that place, and then a few times we heard some very deep and low growling, and we were pretty sure we were being watched by some form of wildlife that was making us all very uneasy. We saw eyes in the trees, you know, shining back at us a couple of times, and we were, to put it bluntly, very frightened about that. Oftentimes we would all sort of go into our tents and zip them up and not try and think about it, you know, and maybe we'd had a couple of ciders, so that would help. But it wasn't until years later I actually worked with a lady in the care system. I did care work for a couple of years for some troubled young people, and one of the ladies I worked with, a program was on about big cats, and I said, oh, do you think that these things are around? And she said, oh, 100%. I said, what makes you so sure? And she said to me, well, I've actually come across one, you know, I've seen one right up close. And I said, well, where was this? And she said, well, I used to live near Amberley, near Arundel, and I used to go walk down the river next to this place called Southwood. And I said, wow, Southwood, we actually used to camp there as kids, you know, quite regularly. And she said, well, I was taking my Alsatian down the riverbank there, just next to the Duke of Norfolk's land, which is exactly where we were camping, just on the other side of the broken wall there. And she said her dog suddenly froze, and out of a tree sprang a very, very large black cat that was much bigger than her Alsatian dog. It basically sprang into the middle of the track, looked at her dog. Her dog cowered and went behind her, and her dog was, you know, quite a big and brave Alsatian, so it was absolutely fearing for its life at this point. The cat then sprang up over the wall, which was quite a big jump. You know, this wasn't a domestic cat. A huge jump up and over this wall, and then just disappeared. She was panicked. She ran back down the track, and at the end of that track there's a farm, and then across the road there's a pub called the Georgian Dragon. She ran immediately into the pub and said, help, help, you know, someone call the emergency services. I've seen a huge cat, you know, some sort of Black Panther or whatever. And all the locals turned around and went, yeah, it's no big deal, we've all seen it, it's been there for ages. And they basically just sort of shooed her away and said, don't worry about it and don't talk about it, because we don't want the interest, we don't want a bunch of people turning up down here. Again, that was quite a few years ago, so I would imagine that thing has long gone by now. In Lincolnshire, we have the same sort of stuff going on. I've certainly seen deer carcasses pulled up into trees around the area that I was living when I would go out shooting in the woods. And one of the old boys that I'm very good friends with has seen this big cat 3 times now. He describes it as a large black cat. He 100% believes that it's a wild cat that's been released and is just preying around on the fields. Several of the farmers have lost sheep and livestock, so I do believe that. I think back in the late 80s there was a ban that came in from people keeping these dangerous pets. Most of them were like rehoused in zoos and sanctuaries. Not all of them could be, and some of those people may have released those animals out into the wild and just thought, instead of having them destroyed at cost, that they're just going to release them, and hopefully the animal will go on to lead some sort of lifestyle. Maybe that was the cause of these big cats escaping and being able to live off the land. They are known to be excellent predators. They're also known to be very, very evasive and good at avoiding humans. You know, if people have been on safari and gone out looking for things like leopards and pumas, most of the time they never see them, because these things are excellent at evading being observed. So that's of no surprise to me either. The last one was pretty funny. When I used to go fishing down in Chichester gravel pits, again on the south coast, back then there was some big gravel pits at Chichester that were almost free to fish. I think it was supposed to pay someone £5 a day, but the guy never ever turned up. And there was some really big carp in these things, you know, like 30, 40 pound carp. So of course I used to go down there with my fishing gear, pitch up for a few days. One time I was fishing on my own, and I remember seeing what I thought was an otter coming through the water. Some sort of animal like that, you know, the head was poking up. And I thought, what the hell? So I go out to have a look. I'm standing by the bank, and this thing is coming directly towards me. So I think, yeah, interesting. I'm getting ready to see what it is. And then it kind of turns and goes past me sideways. And it was actually one of the biggest snakes I could ever imagine. Its head was maybe this round, very, very large. The body was like huge. It went on for, you know, many, many feet as it went past me. I'm actually really frightened of snakes, so that was like the worst possible thing I could ever imagine seeing. I was in somewhat of a state of disbelief, because I was only about 13, 14, and my understanding was that we didn't have those kind of snakes in this country. I actually got laughed at. You know, I spoke to other anglers, I spoke to a few friends, and they all just dismissed it and said, oh, what have you been smoking, and, you know, making silly jokes. No one believed me at all. And I was speaking a couple of years later to a guy who ran an exotic pet shop that I got talking to in a pub, and I told him about my experience, and he said, mate, you're not the first person to tell me a story like that. We have had lots and lots of snakes that have been returned to us you know, by the police or the RSPCA or whatever, where people have bought a massive great boa constrictor. They've struggled to look after it when it gets to a certain size, so they think, what do? I'll go and chuck it in a local lake. And these things, as the lakes sometimes can stay reasonably warm depending on where they are in the country and the local environment, that these things can actually live quite successfully off the fish that are spawning in there. Plenty of food source for them, and it's possible one could actually live in there quite a long time and get very sizable. So he totally believed me. I to this day still swear that exactly what I saw was a very, very large snake in that place, and I didn't go and fish there much after that. I found a couple of other lakes that suited me a little better. That's the extent of my unusual experiences. If you've had any strange experiences with the paranormal, ghosts, UFOs, strange animals, then let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear whatever you guys have experienced. Do you believe in this stuff or not? I certainly believe what I've seen, and I believe a couple of the guys that have told me things. I've also met people that have told me things that frankly I don't believe, because the people seem kind of wacky. Maybe they were true, I don't know. Have a chat about it in the comments. I can't wait to hear what you've got to say. Thanks for watching, guys. Catch you all next time.